Hello and welcome to Table Talk, a show where I chat with other creators in the TTRPG space about how they run their tables. I'm Danger Dan Jers, the GM and host of D&Dark, and joining us at the table today is the GM of the Candela Obscura podcast, Momento Talis, Liv. Hello, Liv.
Hello.
So to get us started here, can you tell us a little bit about your history with the TTRPG community and about your show, Momento Talis?
Yeah, so I haven't actually been in the TTRPG community for very long. It's about been 4 years. I know a lot of people are like, oh, I've done this all my life. I actually only got into it in my mid-20s, which still sounds young, but, it feels late for a lot of people in the community. And, it's funny, I just kind of stumbled upon this after getting out of a bad relationship. I was discovering myself again, and I stumbled upon the biggest name in the community, Critical Role. And it just kind of, sparked that fire within me to start telling amazing stories with my friends.
That's awesome. I know the pandemic was a huge inflection point for a lot of people jumping into this kind of hobby space. So was it similar for you with that kind of timing? Or I know you said it was coming out of a bad relationship and finding Critical Role. Did that kind of coincide with having more downtime during the quarantine lockdowns and all of that?
Yeah, it was kind of like the perfect storm, right? Getting out of a bad relationship, but also COVID. And not only that, I had moved to a new city. I am based out of Portland, Oregon. And, being a young adult in a new city is terrifying. So, of course, I was trying to grasp at anything that would, I could find joy in. And then, of course, finding Critical Role, I was like, wow, I could tell stories like this. That's awesome. And, I have always been a storyteller. I thought I would do video game storytelling, but that's really hard. So, to realize that you could just tell stories with your friends with a few shiny math rocks, like, wow. All right, that's awesome. And then, of course, when Critical Role started playing Candela Obscura, I fell in love with the system immediately. And I started to dream about doing my own AP podcast. And for reference, I've never GM'd before. I've never done any of this before. So it was just kind of like, let's jump into the deep end. Why the fuck not? So one October day, I reached out to a few friends who had a background in acting, Izzy being one of them. He's one of our players and our editors. And we got together to plan. I reached out to another friend of mine, Rachel. She lives down in LA, and she introduced me to her other friend, Sam. And together we decided, yeah, let's do this. So, and then we're like, well, we're going to name this. And I thought maybe Memento Mori, but that's kind of overused. Everyone says, oh, remember you'll die. So we replaced it with Momento Talis, which Talis means dice in Latin. Only to stumble upon that it's an actual phrase. It means such a moment. And so that kind of became our driving light, our goal, that we want to build moments with each other and tell a story and let the dice decide the story.
That's pretty fun. I love the coincidence with Momento Talis as a pre-existing expression, and I sympathize intensely with starting off in the deep end. D&Dark similarly was my first experience as a GM, and it was very much taking the high wire without the safety net.
Right. You could fall, but heck, let's do it anyway.
Absolutely. And there's something about the added aspects of doing it for an audience that really changes the shape of what you're doing. There's several decisions that I made for D&Dark that I probably wouldn't have otherwise if it was just like a home game with friends, and vice versa. There's a few things that I might have incorporated into the show that I decided not to otherwise, specifically because we were recording it. So just out of curiosity, for starting off your first big experience as a GM doing an actual play, how has that kind of colored your perception of approaching the games?
Obviously watching Critical Role do D&D, you learn the system by watching. At least I'm good by learning by watching. And so when it came to digging into Candela, I got some of the sense of it, but digging into it as a GM, I did a lot of homework. I was like, okay, how does the system actually work? Because I want to make sure that as the GM at this table, as an AP, that not only, are we playing correctly, that I could also explain it when my players also have, questions as well. Whereas, like, a nice casual game, I probably wouldn't have looked into the rules as much. I would have played it all loosey-goosey. But for that being said, like, Candela as a system is really easy to get into because it's not so crunchy. There's not so many rules. It's a lot of role play.
So jumping off of that, for anyone unfamiliar with Candela Obscura, can you just kind of briefly give a rundown of how that system works and what, like, the baseline rules are?
Yeah, so Candela Obscura uses the Illuminated World system, which is a 6-sided dice system, so you only have d6s. And then based on how your character is created, you can have more 6-sided dice based on, whatever skill you're going to check for. So like a soldier would probably have more skill in movement and maneuvering in a stressful situation, whereas a medium may not be so nimble. And real simple, it's 6 is a success. Say that 5 times fast. And double 6s are critical success, so you get a lot. You get more than what you ask for. 4 and 5s, mixed successes, so you get what you want, but it comes at a cost. 2 and 3 are considered mixed failures. You don't get exactly what you want, but you might get a little taste. You might get a little something. And of course, the dreaded 1. If you get 1, complete failure. Something bad's about to happen. Something bad is waiting for you. And of course, there's the marks and scars part of the system where if you take 3 marks, brain, body, and bleed, you get a scar. And at 4 scars, you're dead. So that's sort of how health is regulated. And again, a lot of it's role play. So, the GM can deal out these marks as they so please. And I will find myself sometimes not wanting to deal out marks as much because I actually really like these characters.
That I know is a hurdle that a lot of GMs tend to come across at some point. Like, kind of ripping off the Band-Aid and getting your first character death is a pretty significant moment. I would say on technicality, I haven't gotten there yet, but it's one of those things too where it's very difficult to keep a character dead
right
once you get to a certain point. It depends on the system too. I don't know with Candela Obscura in particular, but I know with 5e, there's a reason why a lot of people homebrew Revivify either out of the game or they make it a significantly harder threshold to get. Because as soon as that spell kind of enters into the framework, then it becomes significantly harder for characters to actually stay dead. It was interesting. One of the discussions that I had with the cast of D&Dark after we finished season 1 and we're looking into season 2, one of the discussions that we had was how we want to approach the permanency of death and lingering consequences like that, since we have such a character forward and focused show. And one of the interesting points that one of my players brought up, Aaron, who plays the Phantom of the Opera, he brought up that I am perfectly fine with something like Revivify existing if something like Power Word Kill also exists as a counterbalance.
Right. And you need those balances because, like, at some point, death just becomes like a little nuisance. It's like, oh, Jeff died. Don't worry. We'll get him back next day. It's fine.
And that's like my ethos as a GM. I am very much a negotiator. Risk reward is a big forward focus of mine. So I joke that it's the hack that my players have figured out to get whatever they want from me. But as long as there is an equivalent trade-off or like a significant cost behind it that makes sense for what they are attempting to do, I will let my players get away with more or less anything. There's a lot of cases where I'll bend the rules a little bit about what spells are allowed to do, so long as they don't exceed the level that they are at. For example, Aaron loves to use the spell Prestidigitate in very absurd and like over-the-top ways.
I love that spell.
It's fantastic. And I've let him exceed the bounds of what that spell can do, as long as this is no stronger than any other given cantrip. If this exceeds what a cantrip in general can do, then we'll need to figure something else out. Or there was one case in our season finale where he wanted to use it as a pretext to do a 6th level spell. And basically the argument there was, I want to basically burn a 6th level spell slot to do this thing that is on par and equivalent with a 6th level spell. And for purely flavor purposes, I want to use Prestidigitate to do it. And it's as though I'm upcasting the spell. Still using all of the same equivalent resources that you would use to do it the right way. but just with the added like flavor and fun on top of that. I tend to be very amenable to that kind of bending of the rules to facilitate role play purposes.
Absolutely. And like, I think with a system like Candela, because it's so rules lax, there really isn't something that doesn't say, oh, you can't come back. But I think with the system itself, it's built around the idea of role play. So like, as you continue onward in the journey with these characters, they're not getting better necessarily. They're kind of, as one of my friends described, they're getting more worn down as you continue on. They're collecting marks and scars, and these things don't go away. And eventually, they could die. And unlike D&D, it's not like you're building up to be super powerful. You're, in fact, kind of just going until you can't.
Mm-hmm. From what I understand of the different Darrington Press games, I know that that's pretty typical for what Critical Role likes to put out. They tend to be much more role-play focused and much more rules light, which I know makes them a little polarizing. I've heard similar things about Daggerheart, their new system, that it is very role-play forward, and the ways in which that manifests are a little bit, I don't want to say controversial, but like polarizing. People are kind of split. They either love it or hate it. So from your experience in playing Candela Obscura, have you played any other systems that you can compare it to? And like, what about the system do you like that you feel it does more strongly? What do you think are some of the drawbacks compared to something like 5e, for example?
Yeah. In terms of like 5e, comparison, Candela is really great introduction to TTRPGs, I think. Like, again, it's my first time GMing. So, you know, it was really easy to step into as a new GM because I didn't have to memorize all these tables or all these, you know, rules. Granted, you know, when you're around a good table, everyone will kind of share the burden of the rules. But for this one, it's like, okay, I don't really need to memorize the rules necessarily. Like, there's in-world rules, of course. But out of the world, like in the system itself, it's just do what you think is cool and what would tell a good story. And whereas like, you know, 5e is, you know, there's rules. But of course, it's also like I played D&D is one of my first TTRPGs as well. So, you know, it wasn't hard to get into with 5e. But comparatively, Candela is very light and very just kind of go with the flow. So it kind of falls on the GM a little bit more to facilitate what's going to happen in terms of role play and events, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit, I want to kind of touch back on a thing that you were saying earlier of being drawn into the space by Critical Role and them being such a huge touch point for your story. Obviously, since it is their system, they're going to be a huge source of inspiration from you. But in the work that you were doing to set up Momento Talis, what all were like the points that you were looking to for inspiration? As an example for me with D&Dark, when we were getting started, in jumping into the deep end of starting off doing an actual play, I did a ton of research diving into like Critical Role, Dimension 20, Dungeons and Daddies, Not Another D&D podcast, The Adventure Zone, to try to figure out like, okay, what are other shows doing? What are the things they're doing that I like? What are the things they're doing that I don't like? What kind of bits and pieces do I want to take from these to set up and build my show around? So for yours, was it primarily Critical Role that you were drawing from? Were you pulling from other shows? Were you pulling from other media, like any specific games or movies or TV shows? What is your like primary inspiration base that you're pulling from?
That's, you know, a whole big question, and I will go on many tangents here. But first of all...
Sorry, I know that's like 6 questions in one.
It's all good. First of all, like, yeah, Critical Role was a really big inspiration. And I knew when we started this, I wanted us to be familiar, yet still distinct from them. You know, we're not them, obviously. We're not a big old production. We are 4 people across 2 states just doing our little thing. But when it came to like inspiration to actually build these stories, I'm a storyteller. I majored in creative writing. I've always been, you know, a person who tells stories, whether true or not true. And so when it came to, writing these assignments, I really liked taking inspiration from real life. I'm a big sci-fi nerd, nonetheless, but when it comes to like real life, I'll often say reality is stranger than fiction because there's some weird stuff that happens in this world.
Yeah.
I mean, have you heard of the meat storm of Kansas or Kentucky, I think it was? That's weird. So, I built a city for us to play in the same world, in the same era as Critical Role plays in their new fair. But I wanted to feel distinct. So the city is heavily inspired by the Pacific Northwest, inspired by places I've lived and where my players have lived and, our shared experiences. So one of the fun features about the city is in our episode Tunnels to Elsewhere, there are tunnels underneath the city, which are inspired by the Shanghai tunnels here in Portland. Now, if you don't know about the Shanghai tunnels, as legend goes, back in like the 1800s, sailors would come to Portland, they would drink and they would get really drunk and they'd pass out. And sailors from Shanghai would, grab these sailors, hoist them through these tunnels. I don't know how they carried them, but, we can ask those questions later. And the sailors would wake up halfway to Shanghai. And the term was to get shanghaied.
So that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It's a really fun little lore of the city. And so I really wanted to add that into Cascadia to make it feel a little bit more real.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Basing it on the Pacific Northwest is fun. It's always great to kind of like play around in your own backyard. So like as far as the world that you're building goes, how fantastical is it? How kind of rooted in real world is it? Just to kind of pick your brain about the world you've built and kind of how you've gone about creating it. What other specific touch points are there? So like the Shanghai tunnels is a really great example of a specific thing. What else?
Underneath the city, like New Fair, we have a city underneath the city. It's called Armfell, which is Latin again for gold, because in my own experiences, I've lived in California, gold rush country, all that. So Cascadia also has a history of being a mining town. But underneath the city itself, as I was saying, I based the city underneath actually on the old ancient Aztec capital under Mexico City. Now, I can't speak Spanish very well, so it's the capital under Mexico City, I'll just say, so I don't butcher that name and be a bad Mexican. So there's, that inspiration as well. And some of the touch points in our stories, like the museum itself, I didn't really want to build a museum by myself. So I took basically the layout of the Hiroshima Museum in Japan, because one of the touch points, or one of the ways I wanted to make our story different, was I wanted to look at bleed itself, this magical, almost infection in this world, to feel a little bit more like radiation. And that's one of my little niche interest areas. I love stories about nuclear accidents, radiation, things like that. There is horror in radiation itself. That's just so easy to, put that into this world.
Yeah, there really is a lot that you can do with that. Interesting choice to go off of the Hiroshima Museum. Similarly, we have an arc that takes place in a museum in ours. Our show is kind of loosely based in a fictional version of real world England in the 1800s. And we have an arc in the British Royal Museum. And as somebody who has never been to London, I made the layout of that based off of the Fields Museum in Chicago.
See, it's easy to take, they already have layouts. There's so many layouts just floating around. It's easy just to grab one and be like, this is my museum now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And pulling from both real life and from other media can be a really fun way to inject interesting detail work into your world building. Part of it's kind of a cheat for me because like the premise of our show is based super heavily on the classic monster movies. All of our the basic premise of D&Dark is it's a 5e gothic horror campaign where the player characters are all the classic Universal monsters. So I've got that entire suite of movies and literature to pull from, and ours is kind of a weird blend of the Gothic Victorian novels, the American early horror classic movies, and D&D lore, and also just kind of mixed in with the general nonsense that stems from a D&D campaign. The museum, as another example, is structurally and like obstacle course-wise, it's night at the museum. There's a portion that we do where we do a masquerade ball that is pulled from the Dishonored games.
Ooh, yes. I love that game.
There's a segment that we have going through Big Ben that was basically a cross between The Great Mouse Detective and Alien.
Ooh.
Which is, if you've listened through that arc, you understand what I mean by that. It is very hard to explain out of context. So I pull a lot from movies. I pull a lot from books and TV shows. I'm also very heavily inspired by the Discworld series. And so there's some of the more whimsical elements of our world building I pull as either a nod to Discworld or use as like a jumping off point. For example, we do a whole bit going through the 9 layers of hell, and the way that I characterize Asmodeus is based very heavily on Lord Vetinari from the Discworld books. So pulling from pre-existing media and from the real world around you is such a fun way to really shape and structure a world and get something that feels unique. It can often be kind of a pastiche, and ours is a very weird amalgamation of several things, but it feels very unique in that way and becomes kind of like pulpy and comic booky.
Yeah, and it's really fun to take those, inspirations and put your own twist on them. Because, not only are the landmarks in this world are inspired by real life, but some of the people are too. One of our baddies is actually inspired by the first serial killer in the United States, H.H. Holmes. He was prolific. It was part of the Chicago World Fair back, I want to say 1890s. He killed a lot of people. But then the press got a hold of the story and they made it even more fantastical. They said he had a murder castle. No one ever found this murder castle. But when it came to, building the story for my podcast and the session itself, I was like, yeah, he has a murder castle now. Let's do it. Murder castle time.
You can't just leave something with a name like that on the cutting room floor.
Right. That's awesome. Like a whole castle that has like traps and stuff. That sounds like a great time for my players. And they were terrified, but they had a great time.
So in the kind of balancing act between the more fantastical and the more mundane, where do you tend to land? It's kind of an interesting conundrum that I'm looking at for our season 2. We're in between seasons right now, and I'm planning out for our second season, which is we're looking at having it set in America during the 1930s. And there's a lot of fun things I can pull from there. And the focal point of that one, our team of that is going to be made up of famous cryptids.
Ooh.
And so that's going to be a huge focal point of that. So there's a lot of weaving into like some real American history, but a lot of like American folklore, cryptozoology, still more fantasy elements, and like some of our own original lore. Our players are really going off in creating a rich, complex history for these folk characters that have so much more open-ended histories than our season 1 characters do, which have pretty cut and dry backstories to pull from in established literature and filmography. So when you're making a world from scratch, where does that balancing act tend to land for you? Do you tend to go more in the direction of like, let's go for the more whimsical and fantastical things and just kind of make note of the reality behind them, or let's keep it more grounded and more gritty and try to be a better representation of reality?
It's calling it a balancing act is really, that's exactly it, is a balancing act. Candela Obscura as a system is supposed to be horror and gritty and dark. And while it's a lot of fun to have those moments in these games, there's also, we're playing a whole campaign of this. And, to keep our players in the same story, dark and gritty for 10 assignments is really hard. So there has to be, some levity there. There has to be a little bit more of the fantastical aspect. And so like in our episodes, we'll add, for a little levity, we don't have any sponsors, but we'll add like a fake sponsor, in-world sponsor. And it's just us kind of being silly, like, oh, what would be a really silly advertisement? And I think I came up with like a old apothecary selling, snake oil, being like, this will cure you of everything. It might also kill you, but it will cure everything. Izzy had the idea, and I was very we were like, we should make sure that this is satire. But, of course, going back to history, going back to real world, one of the ideas was an advertisement for hiring children to, do factory work or something like that. But yeah, there's a balancing act and, putting levity in between moments. Again, focusing on the characters themselves. They have a lot of really great periods in their episodes where they'll just be hanging out. They'll just be doing things. One of the characters, Maud, she has a fancy for one of the NPCs. Granted, she has a fancy for all my NPCs. I can't have an NPC without them being like, hot girl coming in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on the balancing act between the sense of tension, and horror really only works when there's contrast.
Mm-hmm.
You need to break up the tension with levity, otherwise it just becomes overwhelming and oppressive.
Yeah.
And it's not very effective unless you have a status quo for it to clash with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's normal for people as well when they're scared, when they're nervous, to make jokes. One of our most recent episodes, Maud, upon seeing a scar on Arden's neck, I don't know if this made it on the cutting board, but she made the quote, a really high tramp stamp. I think we all lost it at that point.
They say horror and comedy are neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
They operate on similar principles and they go hand in hand. Horror is very often elevated by the contrast and presence of levity, and vice versa. Levity feels better if it's relieving the tension caused by horror. Anyway, to shift gears a little bit, being a horror campaign and system, what kinds of horror stories tend to hit you most personally that you are drawing from and building off of to focus on that aspect of it?
I really like psychological thrillers. I'm not a fan of things granted, I did watch Final Destination as a child and it scarred me for life. I will never drive behind a logging truck, which is hard here in Oregon. There's a lot of them. But psychological horrors that make me question, reality, existential crisis. Those are the kind of things I really enjoy. And then, like I've said before, something that really freaks me out, but is historically and realistically accurate, is dying from radiation poisoning. The actual, how radiation infects your body and how it slowly dissolves your cells. And eventually you're just a puddle of living flesh is terrifying. And I find that just, really fun to use as, kind of a backdrop of when it comes to this bleed. Because it's not just magic. It's also an infection of some sort.
Yeah, looking at it as a cross between disease and sorcery is a really fun way to approach radiation.
I'm not very spiritual, but I've always said if there is a God, then it is radiation is the nuclear power, because that is just pure energy. And it can create, but it can destroy.
So you dropped a couple of episode premises. What would you say are, if somebody new is wanting to check you out, what would you say is the best starting point, or the strongest overall episode, or the best overall look at what your show is?
It's a hard question because I love all of our episodes, and it is a linear, time as the campaign continues onward. But I would say our best one, our strongest episode that's currently out, would be our prequel holiday one-shot, Silent Night, in which these characters, our players, come together before the events of Tunnels Elsewhere and find that they're not alone in a strange forest. And it's kind of taking on a little bit of those holiday traditions and turning them on their head a bit. But if someone wants to start, I would definitely say start with Tunnels Elsewhere, because that is the beginning of the story. And as we continue on to the story, we build upon it. And it's just getting more ramped up.
Yeah, I can understand that completely. Most of the shows that I interview tend to have kind of a similar response, but I always like hearing what people consider to be their strongest or best representations. That tends to be very telling of what a showrunner's personal values and expectations are. So the prequel one-shot being a holiday special, there's a ton that you can do with that. And I think that's a really solid pitch and interesting direction to go in. Some of my favorite things that we've done have been our little like bonus spin-off one-shots, and it's a little bit different because of the sheer size of our show. We just recently finished our season 1, and so our first campaign was 80 episodes long. So getting people to jump in, I usually recommend our one-shots. We did as holiday specials a Call of Cthulhu campaign and an Alien campaign. We did Muppet Alien.
Ooh.
That was our Halloween one-shot from last year. One of our players had the Alien TTRPG, and it was a pre-built one with pre-generated characters to inject a little bit of levity and comedy into it, because we're a comedy horror podcast, I say, but we're basically like 80-20 in terms of comedy to horror. To inject some levity in it, we did it as the Muppets.
I love it.
We took the pre-generated characters and basically just slapped them as, okay, I'm playing Sweetums playing this character. You're playing Miss Piggy playing the character of the captain, etc., etc. Our previous Halloween one-shot was in the Call of Cthulhu system. It was Call of Cthulhu-Doo.
I love it.
So it was a Call of Cthulhu one-shot that was set in Coolsville, and the players were all Mystery Inc., and it was a blend of a Lovecraftian eldritch horror mystery and a Scooby-Doo Monster of the Week mystery.
That's awesome.
So those self-contained one-shots are where I generally point people to for my show. And for any longer-running show...
And one-shots, I also think, add a little bit less pressure. Because, like, when it comes to our main campaign, I'm building, and we're all building a larger story here. So when it comes to the one-shots, we can kind of just be a little bit more loose. We can, be like... This all will wrap up at the end of the session.
Oh, absolutely.
And we'll all kind of forget about it. But, we all be a little looser here.
Yeah, the brevity of the stories gives a little bit more permission to make crazier choices.
And I'll say with Silent Night, my characters do make some pretty crazy choices. So if you start there, enjoy the chaos.
So that more or less comes to the end of my questions. Are there any other miscellaneous things that you want to add? Any other topics that you want to broach? Any things that you want to bring up about your show that we haven't gotten to yet? Anything that you would like to discuss?
I think I'd just like to say thank you. We're about to reach our 1 year uploading. So I just want to say thank you to everyone.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who has stuck by us for this, our first year. And we just hope we'll get better. And thank you to my wonderful cast who are all working really hard to bring this to life. So yeah, that's all I want to say.
All right. Well, I will extend that thank you to you for chatting with me for this. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Before we go, can you remind us one more time where we can find your show and any links that you want to plug?
Yeah, so you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, RSS.com, YouTube, and you can follow us on social media at Momento.Talis on Instagram. And yeah, come hang out with us. Come, chat with us about your theories, your ideas, what you think will happen next. We're really excited to keep the story going.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for chatting with me. One more time, just want to remind you all, I'm Danger Dangers, the host and GM of D&Dark. I've been chatting with Liv, the host and GM of Momento Talis. And this has been Table Talk. And I hope you enjoyed what we brought to the table. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Table Talk, created, hosted, and edited by myself, Danger Dangers, with artwork by Jordan Nelson. Our guest this episode was Liv from Momento Talis. Links to her work can be found in the episode description. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, reach out to us at DnDarkPodcast@gmail.com. Our theme song and outro was created by Jeremy Vellucci. Check out more of his works on Instagram at JeremyVellucci_Wreck of Time. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time we have a guest take a seat at the table.